And this one down.
Where do you want me to go? Oh, we're supposed to go out there and sit down right now. Here I see.
No. Thank you.
We're all honored. Good evening. I'm Aryeh Neier, professor of psychology at the graduate faculty of the New School and editor of its journal, Social Research. Social Research was first published in 1934 by the founders of the graduate faculty, then called the University in Exile, in honor of the members, all of whom were rescued from Nazi Germany by Alvin Johnson, the first president of the New School and our first Nebraskan. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this 12th Social Research Conference in the series we began in 1988. The root assumptions underlying these conferences are first that the most urgent questions of our day are almost never unprecedented in human history, and second, that this earlier history has the capacity to illuminate the present, even though it is frequently forgotten. At the same time, this series recognizes that there is an unfortunate tendency to address meaningful insights and possible sorry about that. Do it again. At the same time, this series recognizes that there is an unfortunate tendency to address difficult and complicated matters with narrow expertise, even when meaningful insights and possible answers may be found by bringing to bear a wider range of perspectives. We see our mission as fostering an ongoing public forum in which matters of grave interest and concern can be explored not only in terms of their immediate import, but also within their rich historical, cultural, and scientific contexts. We chose the topic of today's conference because, like the subjects of previous conferences, we believe that underlying issues are not only central to our own time and place, but also transcend these particularities. So while an earlier conference looked at the nature and role of privacy as a way of understanding the risk we run when it is threatened, and another conference looked at what it means to have a home and to belong as a way of deepening our understanding of what it means to be homeless and without a homeland, this conference looks at what it means to be afraid. Literally, how fear works both psychologically and physiologically. How it can be, is, and has been manipulated by those with the power to do so. What is gained and what lost by these manipulations, and what, if anything, we can do to protect ourselves not only from what we fear, but from those who benefit from manipulating our fears, which sadly now means both the terrorists and those in power who claim to be acting in our interest. Clearly, we are living at a time, not the first, of collective fear that is encouraged by our government and exacerbated by our media. This fear has its origins, as we all know, in the shocking events of September 11th. Our nation, which had seemed impervious to attack from the outside, suffered grievously at the hands of a small, determined band of fanatics who saw us as the great Satan. We were no longer invulnerable, and our vulnerability required a swift and decisive response. This sense of vulnerability and the fear it engendered quickly became the justification for so much that has been done by our government ever since. In the name of protecting us, 2 wars have been fought, and our constitutional protections seriously curtailed, all in the name of fighting terrorism. The disproportionate fear aroused by terrorist acts seems to call for and to justify disproportionately repressive and aggressive actions. What better time, then, to step back and reflect upon the political uses and misuses of fear? There are many people who are responsible for this conference who cannot be adequately thanked, but they can at least be, some of them at least, can be named. First and most importantly, there is Eric Warner, the imaginative head of the Russell Sage Foundation. Eric not only suggested the idea of this conference to me, but he had the great grace and generosity to support it with funds. And there is a group of advisors who helped us think through the subject of fear, of politically induced fear, some of whom are speaking at this conference: George Kateb, Joe Ledoux, Ken Prewitt, and Corey Robin. There are also the many people around the school, the new school, too many to mention, but most importantly, those in the conference and journal offices who work tirelessly to make this happen: Kara Schlesinger, John Junta, and Maggie Ray. I would also like to acknowledge our 2 fine collaborators, Carol Wilder, chair of the Department of Media Studies here at the New School, who created the poster, slideshow, and the videotape in the lobby. Also, Robert Polito, director of the writing program at the New School, who, with his associate David Lehman, has organized a reading, a prose and poetry reading called Fear, a reading of fearful poetry and prose in conjunction with this conference. Last but not least, Kent Leidecker of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, who once again has collaborated with us around a conference theme. This time, the Metropolitan Museum is offering our conference attendees a special tour of their collections focused on images of fear in art. I also want to acknowledge the help of the Dean of the Graduate Faculty, Richard Bernstein, whose significant support was also essential. Last, but by no means least, and perhaps most of all tonight, I want to thank my cherished friends, Ann and Marty Peretz, who we can all thank for the fact that Vice President Gore agreed to speak tonight, as they were my intermediaries. And of course, there is no way to thank Vice President Gore himself for graciously accepting our invitation to keynote this conference. His being part of this has gone a very long way to make it a very important event. It is now my great honor to turn the mic over to the New School's second Nebraskan, our president, Bob Kerry.
Well, let me, first of all, Arian, thank you. This is the 3rd such conference that I've had the opportunity to participate in with you. I also want to join you in thanking Ann Peretz for bringing the Vice President here. But Arian, you are a remarkable organizer of events like this, and I am very grateful that you're here as a part of the New School, and very grateful for all your efforts. And you appear to me to be someone who will be very glad when this evening is over. So. I also want to say hello to Tipper Gore. It's very nice to be with you again. Earlier, I presented one of my favorite photographers, Tipper Gore, with a photograph of Bernice Abbott that was taken in 1931. Bernice Abbott was an instructor at the New School in the 1930s, wrote a definitive book on photography in the 1930s, and the photograph that I presented to Tipper Gore was one that Bernice Abbott took of Jose Clemente Orozco, who painted the murals on the 7th floor of the New School in 1931. Alvin Johnson, a stingy Nebraskan, persuaded Mr. Orozco to paint those murals for nothing. We now consider them to be invaluable, and we very much welcome you, Tipper, to the New School as well. My job now is to introduce the Vice President. I came to the United States Senate in 1989 and was sworn in at that time by Vice President Bush. And among the people that I wanted to get to know as a consequence of my admiring the way that he conducted himself was Al Gore. Unique in politics, he not only has the capacity but the willingness to probe deep into subject matters, to analyze the subject matter, and then prior to making a conclusion, consult with other people, and once he's made a conclusion, whether it was on national security, whether it was on the environment, whether it was on health care, regardless of the issue, even if you had reached a different conclusion, you could not stand in the well of the Senate and debate with Senator Al Gore without knowing you were debating against a man who was very principled, very smart, and very capable of engaging at the highest level of debate. And as a consequence of that, Senator, Mr. Vice President, your contribution to the United States of America, in my view, is immeasurable. I watched earlier, the Vice President got here earlier and was finishing his speech, and we had to burn it onto a CD, and I thought to myself, I wonder if that's the way President Bush conducts his business. I wonder if he writes his own speeches, and I wonder if he searches deeply into a subject that I know you have for this speech tonight, to analyze it carefully with the capacity to explain a complicated subject in language that we can understand. A word that the Vice President used earlier when describing one of the areas of interest in his speech was the amygdala of the brain. And I told the Vice President, I wonder if our President could even pronounce the bloody word. So anyway, I have on many occasions, and I know I will again tonight, wondered just what might this nation have done the past 3 years if the Supreme Court had elected the man who was elected by the people of the United States of America. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to this conference, to the New School as well, to New York City, the former Vice President, Al Gore.
That was really nice. Thank you. Appreciate it very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much. I am Al Gore. I used to be the next President of the United States of America. I do want to, it's great to be in a blue state. I do want to thank you, Aryeh and others, for inviting me to speak at what I regard as a very timely conference on the uses and misuses of fear in our political system in America. Truly, it's an honor to be part of a program that includes so many distinguished scholars who, unlike me, have genuine expertise in the fields of study that are directly relevant to this topic. I'd like to, in that regard, acknowledge that I've already learned a lot from the people that you have gathered together here, because in organizing my thoughts for this, I had the opportunity to read some of the articles and book excerpts that some of them have written, and I called some on the telephone. I spent 2 hours on the phone with Joe Ledoux yesterday, learned a lot, and with some others. And let me also say at the outset that it is a personal pleasure to share a podium with my friend and former Senate colleague, Bob Kerrey, who brings to this particular discussion not only his experience and leadership in the political world and the academic world, but also, it bears noting because of the subject of our discussions here, his extraordinary personal example of how to stare down the fear of death and lead with raw courage in circumstances that are hard for the rest of us to even imagine. This is a topic where courage as well as fear has direct relevance. We're meeting, moreover, in a city that has itself been forced to learn how to conquer terror. And because we are gathered very close to ground zero, we should, of course, begin our deliberations with a moment of respect and remembrance for those who died on September 11th and for those who have been bereaved. Terrorism, after all, is the ultimate misuse of fear for political ends. Indeed, its specific goal is to distort the political reality of a nation by creating fear in the general population that is hugely disproportionate to the actual danger that the terrorists are capable of posing. That is one of the reasons it was so troubling to so many last week when the widely respected arms expert David Kay concluded a lengthy, extensive investigation in Iraq for the Bush administration with these words, and I quote, "We were all wrong." The real meaning of those words, of Kay's devastating verdict, is that for more than 2 years, President Bush and his administration have been wittingly or unwittingly distorting America's political reality by force-feeding the American people a grossly exaggerated fear of Iraq that was hugely disproportionate to the actual danger posed by Iraq. Now, how could that happen? Could it possibly have been intentional? It's a serious question. More serious than the laughter might imply. And there are some clues to the answer. The fear campaign aimed at Iraq was precisely timed for the kickoff of the midterm election campaign of 2002. You remember that one, the one where Max Cleland, who lost 3 limbs fighting for America in Vietnam, was accused of being unpatriotic? The curious timing was explained by the President's Chief of Staff as a marketing decision. It was timed, he said, for the post-Labor Day advertising period because that's when advertising campaigns for new products, as he referred to it, are normally launched. The implication of his metaphor was that the old product, the war against Osama bin Laden and al-Qaeda, had lost some of its pizzazz. And in the immediate run-up to the election campaign of 2002, a new product, the war against Iraq, was being launched. For everything, there is a season, particularly for the politics of fear. Another clue, it did serve to distract the American people and divert attention from pesky domestic issues like the economy, which were, after all, if you look back, beginning to seriously worry the White House in the summer of 2002. And of course, the third clue is to be found in the now voluminous evidence that the powerful clique inside the administration that had been aggressively agitating for war against Iraq since before the inauguration immediately seized upon the tragedy of 9/11 as a terrific opportunity to accomplish what they had not been able to do beforehand. That is, to invade a country that had not attacked us and did not threaten us. They were clever, and they managed to get the job done. But somehow some deceitfulness took place. There hasn't been specific responsibility assigned for this deceitfulness yet, but it's being investigated by the president. The so-called intelligence was stretched beyond recognition, distorted, and misrepresented. Some of the intelligence that the president personally presented to the American people on national television in his State of the Union address turned out to have been actually forged by someone, though we still don't know who. And amazingly enough, the White House still doesn't seem to really care who forged that document. Imagine for a moment that you were President of the United States. It's not that hard. And imagine that you were standing before a joint session of Congress on live national television, speaking on the one occasion of the year when the Constitution of our nation commands the President to speak directly to the Congress and the American people about the State of the Union. And you delivered an important point on the issue of war and peace. And after your speech, the United Nations, which is where the information came from, the United Nations publicly announced that the document you had been given was a forgery. Would you be embarrassed? Would you ask for someone to be accountable for it? Would you be interested in who forged the document and why and how it got into your hands and why you were allowed to use it in your State of the Union address? Maybe. Sherlock Holmes wrote a famous story in which the clue was the dog that didn't bark. The White House hasn't even growled about who forged the document that got into the hands of the President of the United States and was used on national television. I'm curious, who forged that document? And why has no one pursued it? The CIA warned his staff, we are told, not to let him use that particular document. But there was some kind of regrettable communications foul-up inside the National Security Council. But again, the President's now expressed his determination to find out who the culprit is and who might be responsible for the fact that, again, I quote, "we were all wrong." Over the past 18 months, I have written and delivered a series of speeches addressing different aspects of President Bush's policy agenda, including his decision to go to war in Iraq under what I regard as patently false pretenses, including his dangerous assault on civil liberties here at home, his outrageously fraudulent economic policy, and his complete and total failure to protect the global environment, indeed his invitation to those most responsible for polluting it to step up the pace. And in preparing, delivering speeches on these topics and others that are related, initially my purposes were limited in each case to the subject matter of the specific speech. However, as I tried to interpret what was driving these various and separate policies, certain common features became obvious and a clear pattern emerged. In every case, there was a determined disinterest in the facts. The incuriosity about the document, the forged document I referred to earlier, is not out of keeping with the President's incuriosity in his hour-long meeting with Paul O'Neill, with his incuriosity about the substance of the policies in each of these areas. The second pattern common to all of these policies was an inflexible insistence on carrying out preconceived policies regardless of the evidence concerning what might work and what clearly would not work. First the verdict, then the trial. Third, there is in each area a consistent bias favoring the wealthy and powerful, particularly key members of the electoral coalition that supported him, at the expense of the broader public interest. Next, a marked tendency to develop all the policies in secret and to avoid any accountability to the people, to the Congress, to the courts, or to the press. And in each case, there has been a disturbing willingness to misrepresent the true nature of the policy involved and its real implications. And no matter what the issue, it is now clear that in every instance the administration has resorted to the language and politics of fear in order to short-circuit the debate and drive the public agenda without regard to the evidence or the facts or the public interest. For example, the administration did not hesitate to heighten and distort public fear of terrorism after September 11th in order to create a political case for attacking Iraq where no facts to justify a connection to the attack of September 11th could be found. Iraq was said to be working hand in hand with al-Qaeda. Iraq was said to be on the verge of a nuclear weapons capability. Defeating Saddam was conflated into bringing war to the terrorists, even though what it really meant was diverting resources away from the pursuit of the people who actually attacked us, and it meant causing us to lose focus on that critical task. The administration also did not hesitate to use fear of terrorism to launch a broadside attack on measures that have been in place for a generation to prevent a repetition of gross abuses of authority by the FBI and by the intelligence community at the height of the Cold War. I served on the House Select Committee on Intelligence immediately after the period when the revelations of these abuses led to major reforms. And conservatives on that panel were then resisting those changes tooth and nail. They have long memories. And now these same constraints have been targeted in the Patriot Act and have been either removed or sharply diminished. And of course, the President wants the Patriot Act extended and made permanent. I was encouraged when he made this political appeal for renewal of the Patriot Act in his State of the Union address, and the applause was tepid at best on both sides of the aisle. I viewed that as one of the few bright spots in that speech. Neither did the administration show any scruples at all about using fear of terrorists as a means to punch holes in the basic protections of the Constitution, to create a class of permanent prisoners, to make it possible to imprison American citizens without due process. For the first time in American history, to snatch an American citizen off of the street, put him or her in prison without allowing that citizen to see a lawyer, to see their family, to make a telephone call, to be told what the charges are, or to have any access to due process or the courts. He did not hesitate to totally sequester information about policies and about people, not just from the people themselves, but from the Congress and from the courts, all of which was justified by recourse to fear. Our nation has gone through other periods in our history when the misuse of fear resulted in abuses of civil liberties. The Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798 through 1800, the Palmer Raids and the Red Scare after World War I. Indeed, this university was founded by acts of conscience and courage in the direct aftermath of the Red Scare following World War I. Then in World War II, the internment of Japanese Americans, a shameful episode. Then the McCarthy abuses of the Cold War period. And after each of these periods of excess, we as a nation felt ashamed and tried to make up for the abuses with monetary payments in some cases, with apologies, with new laws and new protections. And although we have not yet entered the period of regret and atonement this time around, it is already obvious that we are now in one of those periods of regrettable excess. The administration did not hesitate to use the politics of fear in economic policy. The fear of a recession was put forth as an argument for massive tax cuts, primarily benefiting the wealthiest, while loading debt on the rest of the country for generations to come. It used fear of energy shortages to build an energy policy made to order for the oil industry at the expense, again, of the rest of us. It used the fear that we would lose a competitive edge to block responsible action to deal with global warming, and has by that action mortgaged not only us but our children and their children to consequences that are unmitigated by any acts of foresight in this generation. Meanwhile, of course, even the Chinese have now passed us in fuel economy standards for new automobiles, just to take one example. This administration uses fear of the problems of old age to contrive an illusory drug bill that essentially transfers billions from the people to the pockets of the large pharmaceutical companies. It does not hesitate to use fear even of God, not only to pronounce its own views on marriage, but to impose them on the nation in the form of a constitutional amendment at election time. At the level of our relations with the rest of the world, the administration has willingly traded in respect for the United States in favor of fear. That is the real meaning of shock and awe. It is this administration's theory that American dominance, to use their word, coupled with a doctrine of preemptive strikes, regardless of whether the threat to be preempted is imminent or not. And incidentally, today, George Tenet, the director of Central Intelligence, made it clear that the CIA never said Iraq was an imminent threat. The threat to be preempted didn't have to be imminent. And this combination of policies, according to the administration, will be sufficient to persuade our rivals and enemies to leave the field. But in addition to asking the question of whether or not the administration's use of fear to manipulate the political process was intentional, I think there is another question that urgently needs attention. How could our precious nation have become so uncharacteristically vulnerable to such an effective use of fear to manipulate our politics. After all, it is a serious indictment of our political discourse in America that almost 3/4 of all Americans were so easily led to believe that Saddam Hussein was personally responsible for the attacks of September 11th. It is an indictment of the healthy functioning of our democracy that nearly half of all Americans still believe that most of the hijackers on September 11th were Iraqis. It is an indictment of the way our democracy is presently operating, that more than 40% were so easily convinced that Iraq did in fact have nuclear weapons. When David Kay said, "We were all wrong," he was speaking for the administration and the intelligence community and the national security experts, but he could just as easily have been speaking for the country as a whole. A free press is supposed to function as our democracy's immune system against such gross errors of fact and understanding. What happened? For one thing, there's been a dramatic change in the nature of what the philosopher Jürgen Habermas has described as a structure of the public forum, the way our political discourse takes place. It no longer operates as it once did. It is simply no longer as accessible to the vigorous and free exchange of ideas from individuals in the way those ideas were freely and vigorously exchanged during the period of our founding. The age of print effectively ended in the 1960s when television overtook newspapers, and that gap has grown dramatically since then. Today, only 17% of college students read newspapers. The dominant medium of political discourse is the 30-second television commercial. Some of the neurologists and brain researchers who will talk at the sessions tomorrow will describe how images, not only the image of the plane hitting the tower, the planes hitting the towers and the Pentagon, but other images of murders on the 6 o'clock news go straight to a part of the brain that is not mediated by language or reasoned analysis. And in the news business of today, the common saying, which I'm sure all of you have heard, is, if it bleeds, it leads. And the second order suffix is, if it thinks, it stinks. And the competition is, again, to use the vernacular, to glue eyeballs to the screen. The ownership of the media companies has also changed. And it's rare for a media operation to be a family business any longer, with a deep pride in the independence and journalistic tradition that has survived over generations. They are now part of conglomerates. Does that make a difference? Perhaps another conference on another day. But where the political system is concerned, it is a fact that the leadership of the Republican Party is augmented by its links to the corporate ownership of these conglomerates that control the majority of media outlets that dominate the news delivery process today. This is a process that of ownership change that is already so far advanced that it alarmed even conservative Republican members of Congress and caused them to join with members of the Democratic Party to oppose the FCC's efforts to make the world of information even safer for monopoly. When error of fact and judgment is no longer caught by the immune system of our democracy, it is time to examine the nature of that dysfunction and to promote the recovery of good health in our political discourse. There is still maneuvering to accelerate that consolidation process, and the President still hopes to carry the day. And this, after all, includes a growing part of the electronic media, characterized by paranoia presented as entertainment. This is the part that allows drug-addled hypocrites, compulsive gamblers, and assorted religious bigots to masquerade as moral guides for the nation. So what are the consequences? Fear drives out reason. It suppresses the politics of discourse and opens the door to the politics of destruction. It also requires us to pay more attention to the new discoveries about the way fear affects our thinking process. Again, these experts on the panels tomorrow have much that is new in their respective fields to share. I'm told by those who I respect in the fields of neurology and brain science that this era is similar to the era when Galileo first used the telescope to deliver a new understanding of the way the solar system actually operated. For most of the last century, the study of the human brain was based on individuals who had freak accidents and unusual injuries. And the doctors would pay attention to what part of the brain was taken out by the injury, and then after careful observation of strange behaviors, would slowly put together what functions were controlled by the part of the brain that had been injured. But now there is the equivalent of Galileo's telescope, and they are able to observe healthy brains in normal operation, measure the electrical function, measure the other indications of what part of the brain is most active at what time, and an entire new understanding is coming forth. And one of the areas that has been richest in the contribution of new understandings about how we as human beings function has to do with fear. In political theory, the common, if usually unstated, assumption is that citizens operate as rational human beings, reasoning their way through the problems that are presented in the political system. As if every question, every problem, and every opportunity is resolved into words and debated, analyzed rationally, and subjected to a discourse with others until there is a reasoned conclusion. But as these scientists will make clear tomorrow, that's not the way it works at all. There are other structures that operate to a large degree independently of the reasoning process. And when fear is activated, it is very difficult to turn off. Fear was activated on September 11th in all of us to a greater or lesser degree. And because it was difficult to modulate or to change in particular specifics, it was exploitable for a variety of purposes unrelated to the initial cause of the fear. When the President of the United States stood before the people of this nation in the same speech where he used the forged document and said, "Imagine, my fellow citizens." He didn't use that last phrase, but he said, "Imagine another act of terrorism." And in essence, what he asked us to conjure was a fictional fear of Iraq giving a nuclear weapon to terrorists who actually had no connection to Iraq. But because our nation had been subjected to this fearful incident, this tragic, cruel attack on us, when our president said, "Imagine with me this new fear," it was easy enough to bypass the reasoning process, the normal discourse that takes place in a healthy democracy, with a give and take among people who could say, "Wait a minute, Mr. President, where's your evidence? There is no connection between Al-Qaeda and Saddam Hussein." He actually said, "You can't distinguish between Saddam Hussein and Osama bin Laden." He actually said that. And because, again, of what these experts will talk about in ways that I could never talk about tomorrow, it was a time of great vulnerability. We placed our trust in President Bush. I placed my trust in President Bush. I went to the Iowa caucuses. The Iowa Democratic Convention in the fall of 2001. I had prepared, I don't mind telling you, in August of that year, a very different kind of speech. But in the aftermath of this tragedy, I proudly, with complete and total sincerity, stood before the Democrats of Iowa and said, "George W. Bush is my president. I will follow him, as will we all, in this time of crisis." I was one of millions who felt that same sentiment and gave to the president total trust and asked him, "Lead us wisely and well." He abused the trust of the American people by exploiting the fears of the American people in order to take this nation on an adventure that had been preordained and designed before the attacks of September 11th ever took place. And the verdict of history will not be a kind one. Our founders had a healthy respect for the role of fear. The root word for democracy, demos, meant to them, as it means to us, the masses of common people who at that time were an object of some fear in the minds of many who were founders of our nation. What they wanted was an orderly society in which property would be safe from arbitrary confiscation. After all, the Revolutionary War was at least in significant measure about taxation. And what they believed was that a too pure democracy would expose that new society to the ungoverned passions of what today some call the street. The passions of people with little to lose, whose angers could be all too easily aroused by demagogues, the same root again, and then turned against those with wealth. So our Constitution, of which we are justly proud, is really in significant measure an effort based at least as much on fear as on hope, to compromise and balance out the conflicting agendas of two kinds of Americans: those who already have achieved material success and those who aspire to it, those who are happy with the status quo and those who can only accept the status quo if it is the jumping off place to something better for themselves. And that tension can never be fully resolved, and it is perfectly clear at the present moment in the profoundly differing agendas of our two major parties. Neither has the fear that underlies these differences gone away, however well it may at times be camouflaged. And somewhere along the line, and I'm going to propose my candidate for when it happened, the Republican Party became, for the core group controlling it, merely the nameplate for the radical right in this country. The radical right is, in fact, a coalition of those who fear other Americans as agents of treason, as agents of confiscatory government, as agents of immorality. This fear gives the modern Republican Party its well-noted cohesiveness and its equally well-noted practice of jugular politics. Even in power, the modern Republican Party feels itself to be surrounded by hostility, beginning with the government itself, which they present as an enemy, extending to those in the opposition party, which they're presently shutting out of conference committees, shutting out of any meaningful participation in the legislative and governmental and constitutional processes, and extending ultimately on to that portion of the country whose views and hopes are represented by the other party, that is to say, half the nation. And under these circumstances, it is naturally, perhaps tragic in the classical sense, but nonetheless natural for the modern Republican Party to be especially proficient in the use of fear as a technique for obtaining and holding power. This phenomenon was clear under both Presidents Reagan and the first President Bush, except softened to an extent by the personalities of both men. Under our current President Bush, however, the machinery of fear is right out in the open, operating at full throttle. Fear and anxiety have always been a part of life and always will be. Fear is ubiquitous and universal in every human society. It is a normal part of the human condition. But we have always defined progress by our success in managing through our fears. Christopher Columbus, Lewis and Clark, the Wright brothers, Neil Armstrong, all found success by challenging the unknown and overcoming fear with courage and with a sense of proportion that helped them overcome the real fears without being distracted by distorted and illusory fears. As with individuals, nations succeed or fail and define their essential character by the way they challenge the unknown and cope with fear. And much depends on the quality of their leadership. If their leaders exploit their fears and use those fears to herd people in directions they might not otherwise choose, then fear itself can quickly become a self-perpetuating and freewheeling force that drains national will and weakens national character, diverting attention from real threats deserving of healthy and appropriate fear, sowing confusion about the essential choices that every nation must constantly make about its future. Leadership means inspiring us to manage through our fears. Demagoguery means exploiting our fears for political gain. There is a crucial difference. 50 years ago, when the nuclear arms race with the Soviet Union was raising tensions in the world, and when McCarthyism was threatening our freedoms, liberties here at home, President Eisenhower said this: "Any who act as if freedom's defenses are to be found in suppression and suspicion and fear confess a doctrine that is alien to America." But only 15 years later, when Eisenhower's Vice President, Richard Nixon, became president, it marked the beginning of a big change in America's politics. Nixon, in a sense, embodied that spirit of suppression and suspicion and fear that Eisenhower had denounced. And it first became apparent in the despicable midterm election of 1970, waged by Nixon and his Vice President Spiro Agnew. I saw that campaign firsthand. My father, who was the bravest politician I have ever known, was slandered as unpatriotic because he opposed the Vietnam War, was accused of being an atheist because he opposed a constitutional amendment to foster government-sponsored prayer in the public schools. I was in the Army at the time, on my way to Vietnam as an Army journalist in the engineers. I had leave the week of the election. Law and order, court-ordered busing, a campaign of fear, emphasizing crime. These were the other big issues that year. It was a sleazy campaign by Nixon, one that is now regarded by political historians as a watershed marking a sharp decline in the tone of our national discourse. In many ways, George W. Bush reminds me more of Nixon than of any other president. Like Bush, Nixon subordinated virtually every principle to his hunger for re-election. He instituted wage and price controls with as little regard for his conservative principles as President Bush has shown in piling up trillions of dollars of debt. After the oil embargo of 1973, we now know Nixon threatened a military invasion of the oil fields of the Middle East. Now Bush has actually done it. Both kept their true intentions secret. Like Bush, Nixon understood the political uses and misuses of fear. After Nixon was driven from office in disgrace, he confided in one of his regular interlocutors these words that were written down and quoted. Nixon said, "People react to fear, not love." They don't teach that in Sunday school, he said, but it's true. The night before that election, 33 years and 3 months ago, Senator Ed Muskie of Maine spoke on national television and said this, and I quote, "There are only two kinds of politics. They're not radical and reactionary or conservative and liberal or even Democratic and Republican. There are only the politics of fear and the politics of trust. One says, you are encircled by monstrous dangers. Give us power over your freedom so we may protect you. The other says, the world is a baffling and hazardous place, but it can be shaped to the will of men. Cast your vote," he concluded, "for trust in the ancient traditions of this home for freedom." The next day, my father was defeated by the politics of fear. But his courage in standing for principle made me so proud and inspired me. So that I really felt that he had won something more important than an election. In his speech that night, he stood the old segregationist slogan on its head and defiantly promised, "The truth shall rise again." I wasn't the only person who heard that promise, nor the only one for whom that hope still rings loudly and true. I hope and believe that this year the politics of fear will be defeated and the truth shall rise again. Almost 3,000 years ago, Solomon warned that where there is no vision, the people perish. But the converse is also surely true. Where there is leadership with vision and moral courage, the people will flourish and redeem Lincoln's prophecy at Gettysburg that government of the people, by the people, and for the people shall not perish from the earth. Thank you.
Aren't you in Michigan?
Thank you.
I'm going to ask you a few questions.
Sure. Ask me about, no, you go, you ask me what you want. Thank you. If you want. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. I'm going to ask about 20 minutes worth of questions. Actually, I'll probably ask like 5 minutes of questions so that I hope you can talk at least two-thirds of the time that we're up here for the next 20 or so minutes. Let me say that right now I have a fear that some of you may sue me for the cold in this room, and I apologize. At least I'm feeling a bit of a chill, and I apologize for that. It was hot earlier, and we tried to turn the temperature down so it wouldn't be uncomfortable. I want to take one additional moment of privilege to introduce Arjun Appadurai, who's over here. Arjun, would you please stand and be recognized? Arjun has just been he just joined us as our provost and chief academic officer. And Mr. Vice President, Arjun and I were talking about the language of fear earlier. He is from Bombay, India, and in India, the largest democracy on earth, the fear of physical death is a rather common fear for politicians to have to encounter on a regular basis. And Arjun has added a tremendous amount to our university, and we very much appreciate his presence. I want to connect to one of the panels, actually, that has three, again using a point of privilege here as the president of this university, three people with affiliations with our university. David Plotke, who is with our graduate faculty, soon to be called New School of Social Research again, is moderating a panel on the language of political fear in politics. And on that panel will be Ira Katz-Nelson, the former dean of the graduate faculty, as well as Ken Prewitt. Ken, it's nice to see you back as well, former dean of the graduate faculty. Let me make a statement, Mr. Vice President. I like you, have a much easier time finding moments when Republicans use the language of fear than I do when I use the language of fear. And there was a moment in the 2000 campaign when you, or probably being honest, it was probably somebody in your campaign said, we'd like you to go up and campaign for the vice president in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan and then go down to central Pennsylvania, because even though you voted for Brady and assault rifle, for some reason they trust you in that part of those two states, and the Republicans are spreading a story trying to provoke fear of people in central Pennsylvania and the Upper Peninsula of Michigan that you were going to take their guns away from them. And I went to both places, and after failing to persuade with logic that was going to happen, I found that my most successful approach to it was to say, well, go ahead and vote for Bush if you want, but you're going to lose your job, you're going to lose your health care, you're going to lose your pension, but you will have your gun, you can shoot yourself when it's all over. So, and between the two of us, we've been involved directly as candidates in 12 campaigns. You 9 since 1976. I've been a candidate 3 times since 1982. And it seems to me, as I think about the language of fear, and this is where I want to get to your own perception of it, it seems to me that the fear is typically associated with some fear of loss of some kind. And the great moment was when LBJ suggested that if you voted for Goldwater, you're going to lose your lives in a nuclear conflagration. But fear of death, fear of loss of health, fear of loss of loved one, fear of loss of self-respect, fear of loss of a job, your health insurance, etc. It seems to me those are the fear of your loss of your guns and fear of your own ability to practice your religion. Those sorts of things are the kind of the common thing that I know you never did it, but I must confess I was party to it from time to time. Talking about those things in language that did provoke fear on the part of the audience. How do you see it? I mean, is it the fear of loss? What is it that people are afraid of? Why does fear motivate?
Well, I think there are all kinds of fears, and the main point that I get from these folks that are going to be part of the panels tomorrow is that whatever the cause of the fear, the phenomena itself is difficult to turn off once it's turned on. Now, fears, some fears that connect to survival are obviously the ones that really grab people. But other fears like unemployment are very real, very powerful. I'm concerned about the economy. I was the first one laid off in this administration. And you really, I can tell you never forget something like that. It was just before noon on January 20th. But fear, as I think about it, can be a very healthy thing. It is a natural part of life. We are hardwired to experience fear. But, you know, part of the essence of the human condition is that the design coming out of this long period of evolution, and I'm always sensitive about getting into evolution. We had a trial in my home state on this, and we lost. But the intricate design that came out of evolutionary development, or creation through evolution, if you prefer, I don't see any contradiction, is not always perfectly consistent with the kinds of lives we live in an urban civilization. And the basic fear module, again, as I understand it from these people, is one that goes back very early in our evolution. But then when we developed the higher order of thinking, we gained an advantage, obviously, in being able to pick up earlier indications of some emerging threat. We gained the ability to conceptualize instead of just perceive threats. But that meant we also gained the ability to conceptualize imaginary threats. And in groups, if people are led and persuaded to conceptualize threats that are not real, those can also activate the fear response. And some of the people that thank you for campaigning for me, by the way.
Yeah.
Some of the people you talked with in the Upper Peninsula and in Pennsylvania had been led to believe that government agents were going to come in and take their guns away from them and their ability to defend themselves and their families. And it wasn't a real fear, as you and I understood, but to them it felt real. Now, if I can make one other point on this.
You can make 3 or 4 if you want to.
Well, they tell me there is this phenomenon called vicarious traumatization. So that just as we can conceive of something that activates the amygdala and starts that fear response, if somebody else, a family member, a member of a group with which we identify, has experienced a traumatic event, it can be communicated to someone who didn't directly experience it. And the physical effects, the blood pressure going up, the heart rate, all of those effects are the same as if that individual had actually directly experienced it. And when you look at the way this relates to memory, it becomes particularly powerful and troublesome. One of the discussions in psychology today that everybody's been talking about is post-traumatic stress disorder. Rape victims, child abuse victims, combat veterans. You and I both know people who experienced that in Vietnam. And according to the explanation of it that was given to me, normally when an experience is translated into memory, it's kind of given a sort of a time tag, and so when you recall it later on, you can say, well, that was before this and after that, or it was 10 weeks ago or 11 weeks ago. But when it's a traumatic experience, all bets are off. It's coded differently, and the amygdala is activated, and that memory is stored in ways that when it's recalled later on, doesn't have a time tag, it feels present. And the memory has the ability to activate the fear response in the present moment, even though it was a long time ago, because it feels like it's happening right now. You combine that phenomenon with the group vicarious mechanism, and here's what you get. In the early summer of 2001, Tipper and I went to Greece. The Pope went to Greece, met with thousands of angry demonstrators holding signs, yelling epithets. I investigated what the heck's going on. They were angry about something that had happened 800 years ago. The Fourth Crusade had stopped off in Constantinople, sacked the city, weakened it for the later overthrow by the Turks, and they're angry today, 800 years later. A second quick example, Milosevic, in the early summer of 1989, went to the plains of Kosovo on the 600th anniversary of the battle that defeated the Serbian Empire in its heyday. They said 1.5 million people came. Western estimates said 1 million people came, physically present, covering the hillsides to listen to that speech. And he revivified the battle of 600 years earlier. And in the immediate aftermath of that collective re-traumatization, a genocide began against the Croats and the Bosnians and the Kosovars, because there was a vicarious experience of a trauma 6 centuries earlier that activated in the physical bodies of the individuals present in this generation a response as if they were reliving that fear of so long ago. If you look at the conflicts on the Indian subcontinent, if you look at the conflict in Sri Lanka, you look at the conflicts in Africa, you look at Northern Ireland, in the Middle East, almost every conflict zone in the entire world has an element of amygdala politics based on vicarious traumatization, feeding off a memory of past tragedies. Now, how does our political process address that? Through reasoned discourse? It's insufficient, and we need a new politics to use new mechanisms like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa, or mechanisms that are not yet invented, to deal with the interaction of the fears and the reasoning process. Sorry to take so long on that.
No, that was great. I mean, you're going to think this is like a Ripley believe it or not coincidence, but I was in Washington 2 Saturdays ago, and I heard George Bush say the very same thing at the Alfalfa Club dinner. It's really that's hard to believe, isn't it? But I'm going to try one more time to sort of bring it back into from our point of view. I mean, I've listened to Democratic candidates in this presidential campaign, and one of the things that I hear. I don't know if it's intentional, so I'll give them the benefit of the doubt and say it's unintentional, to cause people to be afraid of the forces of globalism. I mean, if you go to China or you go to India, and you say in China we've got 400 or 500 million people living on $1 a day that need jobs, and we say in the United States of America, fine, we're for you getting all those jobs, but please don't try to sell us our cotton at world prices. Please don't try to sell us some of your other products at world prices. We're going to put trade policies in place, and that's the promise. It seems to me that I hear, when I listen closely, that somehow I can stop this. I mean, I've heard Warren Buffett, in a rather grisly metaphor, say that from 1914 to 1918, there was a great leap forward in productivity in American agriculture, going from basically horses for power to tractors for power as a result of the Great War and the loss of productivity in Europe. He said there were 6 million horses that were slaughtered over that 4-year period. And then he went on to say, if horses could have voted, it's unlikely that would have happened. Well, I mean, it seems to me that from our side as well, that we use the language of fear to try to get people to say, maybe it's something I can do to stop natural forces and stop the losses that all of us, again, understandably, don't want to have in our lives.
Well, I think there's fear and there's fear. And I think that at least 2 categories ought to be maintained. The fear of economic consequences of a particular set of policies may be very significant and motivating for people, but that's different from the fear that a terrorist is going to set off a nuclear weapon in the city where you live. That's different from the kind of fear of violent crime that Nixon used in a very, in my view, despicable way in that 1970 campaign, where physical survival is connected to the conjured fear. It has a qualitatively different aspect. Again, even those fears should be talked about and can be talked about in a responsible way if they're real and if they're dealt with in a way that has integrity. But anything can be translated into a fear of its consequences or a fear of something having to do with it. But I don't think it's the same as exploiting the fear of terrorism.
I don't disagree that there are qualitative differences. Let me take another example. You came to Washington as a member of the House of Representatives representing the 4th District of Tennessee in 1977. I guess it was your first year. And over that period of time, the Capitol has been converted into a fortress as a result of what I think is a rather irrational fear of the loss of physical life. I mean, the one thing I do know about life is that none of us get out of this deal alive. But if you look at the way Washington has built basically a blockade around itself, and we now know, there's much more damage you can done just through the mails. We're discovering now again in Washington. It seems to me that this irrational fear that you're talking about it has a non-political origin as well. That one of the things that may be going on in the American political system. Remember, prior to 9/11, we were all terrified that a damn shark was going to eat us. Right? I mean, it was, oh my God, a shark was going to get me. And I took a shower I haven't been in a bathtub since all of that. So
Well, think about where that originated. According to the cultural historians, the movie Jaws activated a very different level of fear of sharks. And you talk about the millions of sharks that were killed after that. I mean, that is an example of it's well.
But I mean, I wasn't very articulate in framing the question. The question is, have we in general, independent of the language that's being used, are we more afraid than we need to be? Is there greater existential fear today in 2004 than we need to have, especially here in the United States of America?
I think there is. I think that one of your you want to go?
I mean, I didn't see that Super Bowl, but the only thing during that Super Bowl halftime that I've seen since it frightened me was Mike Ditka on Viagra. I mean, that was scary. Okay, go ahead.
I think I'll pass on that. Well, the process. There was who was this guy who wrote the book Flow? He did a Csikszentmihalyi. I don't know how to pronounce it, but what is it? Thank you. He wrote an article on what goes on in the brain watching television, and apparently there's this thing called the orienting reflex. And as he explains it, during the evolutionary process, our predecessors sitting on the African savanna, the leaves move. The ones who didn't look are not our ancestors. So the ones who did look passed that on, and now in that very ancient part of our brains, when there is a sudden movement in our field of vision, somewhere deep below the conscious brain, a message is sent, look. And so we do. And now, television commercials and many action sequences in television routinely activate that orienting reflex once per second. And after a while, I spent a lot of my summers on the farm in Tennessee. And I'm loath to admit this, but I learned how to hypnotize chickens. And this is a true story. You're looking skeptical.
No, I did. I can hypnotize a turkey, but I've never.
Really?
Yeah.
No, I wonder if it's similar.
Well, let's hear it.
Yeah, well, betcha it is. Hold them down in my process. Take a stick and slowly draw a circle. Is that your process? Okay. So the eyes are on either side of its head, and it follows the stick like this, and after a little while, it goes, and it's in a trance. Okay? So that's what I think of when I look at the fact that, we in this country, on average, watch television 4 hours per day. And a lot of times when I'm watching the television, after a while, if I'm aware, I don't go, and all the time, that those circuits of the brain are being, and the researchers say that you interview people after they go through hours of this, and they feel exhausted, they don't feel good. If you play tennis 4 hours a day, you're going to build up muscles. If you watch television 4 hours a day, and that is the average, what are we building up? We're activating that part of the brain, and we're seeing on the news crime and killings, and then the Super Bowl halftime show comes on, and democracy is not really thriving in that environment.
No, that's true. In fact, I had that very same reflex after only 40 minutes of listening to the President do the State of the Union address. I mean, it's pretty amazing. My Chief of Staff is causing me to have an orienting reflex, which now says that we want to thank you very much, Mr. Vice President, for coming here, and I'm very grateful for your words and very grateful for your service.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It was great fun. Thank you all very much. Thank you.